This will be another quick talk or opinion on my part. I didn't do a lot of fact checking, but it's to the point where like I don't too lazy to or too basing it on stuff that I already know. Or anyways, um, choices were coming down to between Amazon Redshift, Snowflake, or Azure Synapse. Now I would say Redshift used to be the de facto was great, but the problem was it was expensive, and the other factors as well too with Redshift. Um, with the number of instances that you had up, you had to have that data on there as well too for it to work at that point. So if your data was like 1 terabyte, you pretty much it's not 1 terabyte, 10 terabytes. So yeah, it doesn't matter, but 10 terabytes. If you had 10 terabytes of data and in the database, you would have to replicate it 10 times over, or replicate those 10 terabytes over to the number of nodes that you had for Redshift as well too. That was the one thing about Snowflake that was really great was you weren't paying for the storage itself, you were just paying for the compute. So in reality, the data itself resided all in one at the time an S3 bucket, and all the data was there. So you just had basically multiple engines reading from the same data source. It was almost like the Netezza model, basically, where Netezza was more hardware, multiple stacks of the engine, and then just like one storage, and then you just basically read off of that at that point. That was one of the things I think Snowflake took off, and they realized, we could do this on a cloud-based aspect, which worked. Uh, Microsoft seeing what they were seeing, SQL Server not being as, or their SQL warehousing was not growing as I thought they would be on the Azure environment. They figured, what, let's take the best of what Databricks and Snowflake has and apply both of them together. So now you have Synapse. And Synapse is basically so similar to Snowflake, to the aspect of like you have these quote unquote warehouses, basically just virtual nodes that reads off the same data, off the data lake essentially now has become the new terminology, of course, the data lake. But the other aspect is like they've incorporated from Databricks Spark as well too. So it's a case where like applying a Spark within the Synapse environment as well too is also a big factor. And I think Snowflake was staying away from that a little bit because they didn't want to compete directly with Databricks, but at the same time, it looks like they're going to have to. And the fact that Synapse is getting steam, getting enough traction that Snowflake is going to have to like change a little bit, or not change, but more of update themselves to the current times and account for not only the aspect of Spark, but I think more to the fact of running it against a sort of much larger warehousing environment to support AI or machine learning for that matter. And that's where I think Databricks come into play. That works really well compared to Synapse and Snowflake. Synapse, of course, taking the best of what Databricks has, is going to try to apply that into their environment, to that Synapse workspace environment as well too. So if I had my choice right now, I probably would go with probably Snowflake still, because the fact is it's still cheaper, but the other factor is it's still to the point where like you can run it across multiple cloud environments. Um, Whereas Synapse only works on Azure. Databricks works on all three as well too, plus their own, honestly, but the only difference is it doesn't have that same functionality as Snowflake does, which was what Snowflake is really good for. But Databricks, of course, being the fact that it's more Spark based and Spark SQL and such, I think that's another aspect as well. But the fact is, like, all of them are still supporting Parquet file formats. Now, the question is like, if there's a new file format that makes it much more scalable, much more compressed, and much more easy to use, the question is who will adopt it faster. And I have a feeling it would be most likely Databricks, and then Snowflake will adopt it afterwards. Synapse might be a little bit slower unless they see much more larger adoptions and much a case of like it being adopted much more quickly compared to other file formats. Then I think then Synapse or Azure will take it in place as well too. But if I had my choice, like I said, I would go with Snowflake. The reasons being basically is one, I think its cost is one factor, and two is the fact is like with the data lake and the fact that you can go against different cloud service providers can work at that point. Would I go the Databricks route? Not just yet. I mean, it's still good for to certain extents of certain use cases that you want, and ML is a really good aspect as well too. But then again, So is Snowflake. Now the real question comes down to is for the graph databases. Now I'll go into that into a different video altogether as well too. But right now I'm saying right now is if I had a choice, I would stick with Snowflake for now. For now, another 2 years from now, it might be a different story altogether. Now Mongo, everyone would say Mongo. Mongo, yeah, it works, but I don't think it scales out to what Snowflake, Synapse, and Databricks does at this point. Redshift kind of works. I think they're reworking the model a little bit. Now, the honest opinion for me basically is this: is if you can get the Postgres warehouse engine or MySQL kind of in a kind of Kubernetes environment, somewhat mimic what Snowflake and the Synapse does as far as these warehouses, where you have separate pods that can within the containers themselves to read from the same data source, and sort of essentially create that aspect of splitting and distributing the query in a parallel manner. I think you'll see a lot of people shifting towards that at that point, to be quite honest, especially on the on-prem environments more than the cloud, but probably on the cloud environment as well too, specifically if you have to read from a data lake. The question is like integrating other tool sets like Spark and such, where that could still work off on in and of itself, basically as a separate tool set or pipeline, basically. But right now, I would say I would go with Snowflake. Honestly, it's not great reasons right now, but being in the industry for so long now, seeing what it is, seeing some of the limitations that Synapse has versus Snowflake, I would still stick with Snowflake at this point, to be quite honest. Again, subscribe if you were to subscribe. Comment, leave feedback in the comment section. I'd love to get some feedback about this and your opinions about it as well too, to be honest. Which would you choose? Snowflake, Synapse, Databricks, for that matter, or MongoDB? And I'll try to answer them if there are any questions in those comment sections. Again, subscribe, like, or dislike. It's up to you. But again, unfiltered, unedited, and unrehearsed, as you see here. Until next time.